I've thought a lot about what it might be like to stand here in front of you today. Terrifying, definitely. Empowering, maybe. I'm not there yet, but I might be there by the end. Yet I've spent my career so far as a PhD researcher, writer, disability advocate, telling people that the presence of vulnerability doesn't mean there's an absence of courage. So in the interest of taking my own advice, I'm going to begin by telling you a story, one of my own most visceral memories of vulnerability. I was underwater, and there were 6 bodies holding on to me. Hands grabbed my throat, my arms bruising me. The water was pushing down, and my lungs were burning. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the very density of the water would cave my skull in. And I was the only person that could swim. So our survival depended fully on me. And I was thinking pretty fast. Earlier that summer, I'd arrived in Tanzania with little to no regard for myself. I went through life like everyone else. I went through the motions, breathing in, breathing out, keeping moving forward. But all the time I had this fear, this deep understanding and belief within myself that I never spoke about, that there was something inherently wrong with who I was, that how I moved through the world was different to other people and it wasn't right. It was this difference that I thought of when I was underwater. It held me down like an anchor, and it was almost enticing, almost like a siren's call. And I had another thought. Wouldn't it be easier to just give up? To set down this heavy existence, to feel lighter for one moment? Yet I answered this call by pushing forward, giving a great push with my legs. Somehow, we all landed on the shore of Lake Malawi, and I looked around and I realized we'd survived. But also in that moment, a fundamental truth had been revealed to me. I wanted to live, and I wanted to live well. It would be another 4 years before I'd understand the source of this difference that have followed me quite doggedly throughout my life. Because at the age of 26, I learned that I'm autistic. I'm going to share my journey of self-acceptance with you today. It's a path I'm still on, but I've learned some valuable lessons along the way, and I'd like to share 3 of them. The first is the simple power of a single kindness. At the age of 19, I moved to Galway to study creative writing. Storytelling and writing is probably my one true love, so I loved it. But I also was overwhelmed. There was so much new. New classes, new friends, new bed, new city, new expectations. Before long, I found myself sitting in front of the doctor in the student health unit, feeling so panicked. I remember how he fiddled with his feather pattern tie, and he asked me why I'd come in. I had rehearsed this answer, but in that moment, I blurted out something that felt so true. I said, I think I'm the wrong flavor person for this world. I think that might have been my first real experience of drowning. The doctor took this as a surface level experience of anxiety. And he wasn't wrong, and I agreed. I was anxious, there was no doubt. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the full story. I knew there was something different about the lens at which I viewed the world, about how I experienced overwhelm. Here might be an important point to stop and explain the difference between how I experience overwhelm as an autistic person and how other people might experience overwhelm. I and other neurodivergent individuals experience heightened emotions. If you haven't heard the word neurodivergent before, it comes from the word neurodiversity, which simply refers to the natural variance that occurs in human brains. Like no 2 brains are the same, just like biodiversity in nature. A lot of different conditions fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity. ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, Tourette syndrome, and autism. There's more though. And so, all of us experience overwhelm a little differently. For me, it doesn't really feel like I just simply have too much on my plate. Instead, it feels like my every sense is heightened. I can see everything in minute, horrifying detail that I can't turn off. I can't compartmentalize my senses. Smells, taste, touch, everything crushes inward, like a pressure cooker, building, building, building. It's an overwhelming experience. And the problem with living in a world that isn't fundamentally built for you is that there's rarely a point in your life when you're not overwhelmed. I, and many people around you, are living in a constant state of extremes. Somehow, though, I made it through my first year of college. I worked through a checklist of young adulthood, but by the time summer arrived, I collapsed. I cocooned inward, unwilling to leave the house, exhausted. My life-changing kindness came on a day like any other that summer, a day that began with absolute apathy. I was going to visit my aunt's house because some of my cousins were home from England. This is going to be hard. I knew it was going to be hard. I was going to have to be kind, polite, the definitively happy person. I didn't know it at the time, but I was preparing myself to mask. Masking is something that neurodivergent people tend to do, where we suppress behaviors that set us apart. You might be thinking that everyone masks, and to a degree that is true. But neurodivergent people, it's slightly different because it involves suppressing the very essence of who you are. Everything that makes you you, all of your individuality is suppressed, subconsciously or rather consciously, telling you that it is wrong, that how you are inherently is not right. What I didn't account for that day, however, was the sheer exhaustion of feeling nothing. By the time the introductions were over, I was sitting at the kitchen table with everyone else like a rag doll. I was burnt out. I'd run out of steam. I was a prop amongst the chatter. Until I heard my aunt tell my cousin that I was studying creative writing. Writing is perhaps the only thing that would make it through to me in that moment. I looked up at him as if through a fog, and I smiled. Victor is my cousin. He has freckles like me. He's profoundly generous. There's 2 generations between us, but that day Victor looked at me as if he saw the heaviness in me for what it was. Exhaustion at a lifetime spent coping. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, and he quickly scribbled something on it before handing it to me. Creative Science Foundation, it said. Victor explained to me that the Creative Science Foundation is a non-profit organization where scientists, technology experts, biologists, artists, painters, writers come together, everyone from different disciplines, and works on building prototypes of technology that can help our future. It's a place, Victor explained, where they believe we are made stronger by our differences, not divided by them. Something I think that was in hibernation within me for a long time nudged awake at that. Shoot me an email, Victor said. I didn't realize it at the time, but what Victor was doing was erring on the side of kindness. He saw the vulnerability in me, and instead of turning away, he pulled up a seat for me at the table. And more than that, he was offering to hand me the mic. And now I stand here in front of you, made whole in the complete knowledge of who I am. Victor's kindness set me on a path to learn the second lesson I want to share with you today, which is the importance of prioritizing empathy over conformity. At my first ever academic conference, I was given an opportunity to run a workshop. It was going to be a workshop on different tips for writing short stories, and I was so nervous. I felt sick. I almost didn't want to do it. But something about this constellation of people, so eclectic, so different, coming together, felt so right that I pushed through, and it felt amazing. Until about halfway through, when a young man in the front row raised his hand. I'll always remember him because the way he frowned made his forehead look like it had plow lines. I gestured for him to speak up, even though my stomach was in knots. It was as if this was the moment I was going to be found out, discovered for being a fraud. I'm going to be honest with you, he said. His voice was a little bit unsure. I'm not sure many people think like you do. That was all he said. I'm not sure many people think like you do. My palms grew so sweaty. I was holding a clicker and my presentation behind me was frozen on a slide where I thought I was carefully outlining ways to write short stories in a way that anyone could do it. It was as if a lifetime of self-doubt was knocking on my temples. Until I decided to be vulnerable. And I looked into his eyes and I saw something familiar there. His own doubt. And I realized he wasn't judging me or my ability or my brain. He was doubting his ability to conform to my behavior, to my way of thinking. The resulting conversation about what it is to be different was profoundly interesting and informs my PhD research to this day. The numbers of neurodivergent individuals have nearly tripled since the year 2000. It's estimated that between 30 and 40% of our society is neurodiverse in some way. So we make up society, but we don't shape it. We experience unprecedented rates of unemployment, depression, and suicide. It's my belief that our misunderstandings about these conditions, in my case autism, contributes to this. In short, our preconceptions are failing us. Recently, a friend of several years told me that they didn't like what my autism diagnosis had done to me. I was louder now. I took up more space, and that made them uncomfortable. In their mind, it was the label that had changed me. Because after all, I suppose I've always been autistic, whether I knew it or not. And they're right, I am changed. But I'm also freed. And this is our third lesson. By viewing somebody else's identity as a problematic label to be solved, or a deficit, we do our society a tremendous disservice. In the short 2 years since my own diagnosis, I've come to learn what it is to fully accept someone's identity, without suspicions, without agenda, without ideas in my mind about who they could be if they tried hard enough. At my second academic conference, I got to do something different again. I got to run a seminar. It was for educators, lecturers, teaching assistants, anyone who was interested in writing and teaching writing. And the crux of my talk was going to be about constructing unconventional characters, sometimes unlikable characters. I began by asking the room what it is that makes a character unlikable, and in some cases, people unlikable. I was met with such silence. The silence that follows me today. And I realized I was going to have to get the ball rolling by being vulnerable. So I started listing words. Loser, loner, freak, cold, sensitive, intense, too much, not enough. These are words that have followed me my entire life. Sometimes whispered, reaching me almost on the wind, in a way that I was never meant to hear them. Sometimes said exactly to my face, unavoidably. But it did get the room talking. And we realized through discussion that what makes a character unlikable, and maybe a person, at its core is someone who behaves differently than an apparent norm. By vehemently denying somebody's label, we only make room for other labels, ones that we have no control over. And I speak from experience when I say that it is these words that have left an indelible, painful mark on me, and not my autistic identity. I'd like to finish today by being vulnerable with you one last time. I stand before you today proud of who I am, made whole really. But when I was first diagnosed, I didn't feel proud. I felt devastated. It was as if this chasm opened up inside of me that was howling with wind that moved with my every heartbeat. Different, different, different. But I didn't feel devastated because I was autistic. I felt devastated for the 26 years I'd lost. Lost to isolation, loneliness, feeling different, telling myself I was wrong. Who I was is wrong. My experience isn't unique. I know this from the hundreds of autistic adults I work with. We grieve for the times we clipped our own wings, cut corners off of ourselves, hoping that if we just tried hard enough, we'd finally be accepted into the fold. For too long, we've been building a society that tolerates differences rather than celebrates uniqueness. To be different is to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to be gloriously alive, and I'm so glad I'm different. It is my true hope that one day our children can look at each other and themselves and realize that they are exactly who they need to be from the very beginning. I'll leave you with a final request. If you are ever fortunate enough to get the opportunity to give someone a leg up, invite the entirety of who they are to the table. Because you never know. They might someday stand in front of a room like this because of a piece of paper passed over a kitchen table 10 years ago. May you live and live well. Thank you.